the gospel must include even the grim details of what happens when humanity rejects God's pursuit of relationship. You remember the book of Judges in the previous video? This was recorded and kept for the sake of Israel to teach them about the consequences of sin. Without understanding the costs of sin, I think a couple things happen. We can underestimate the severity of the judgment that we incur. We can even take for granted God's great forgiveness. Remember Lamech in Genesis chapter 4. Well, this fourth video and your subsequent study looks deeply into the brutal consequences, really, to Israelite society for rejecting their covenant God and their Creator, and instead their pursuit of idolatry and the resultant injustices. Well, so this fourth video is the fourth context of 10, and we see that the united monarchy has quickly been divided into two nations and became a house which was very soon to fall. So let's go to work. Remember, this is our timeline of the complete biblical history of Israel from the beginning of every nation and every human on earth until the coming of Jesus, otherwise known as the Old Testament. And once again, I think Jesus' life is the completion of the Old Testament. Well, by the end of this video series, you are going to know this like the back of your hand. This is your spiritual family history. You need to know it. And I think I'm going to put together a little test sheet and see how you do at the end of the video series. So here's a review. The more times you review, the deeper it goes into your understanding. So the first video was about the pre-Israel worldview of the nations. Why did the world need Israel and need Israel to obey God and communicate God's true gospel? The second period was tribal Israel. And remember, this initial stage could have been the greatest thing ever. No human king needed. Pure family plus a priesthood. But we saw that they failed to reach God's highest inheritance for them. Well, the third context was the amazingly successful 120 years of the united monarchy. Now, this fourth context that you see on the timeline covers just over 200 years. You can read about it in Kings and Chronicles. Plus, you get to read those 6 writing prophets and the continued wisdom literature. These are amazing books. So let's see what happened here during the division of Israel into 2 separate nations. The divided monarchies. Again, take some screenshots or write really quickly. I'm giving you a lot of text in this portion of the videos. Here's the divided country. It's a bummer. It's a broken family, my friends. 10 sons to the north, 2 sons to the south. God's family was a family no more. Here's how it happened. At Israel's height, Solomon fell away from God. You can read about it in 1 Kings 1 through 11, but especially in chapter 12. Turns out Solomon promoted the idolatry of his many foreign wives. Even though Moses had warned him, marrying unbelieving women from other nations is going to turn your heart away from God. Solomon, the wisest guy ever, didn't listen. He was too proud. And he actually built temples for foreign gods in Israel. The second thing he did, he mistreated some of the tribes during the building of the temple and his palace to the point of being accused of enslaving them, treating the other tribes like their slaves. My friends, there's a pattern here. Solomon's 2 problems were idolatry and injustice. These are the 2 objects of prophetic rebuke throughout the Old Testament. It's always these two things. They're inextricably linked. When you serve idols, you treat people like idols. Does that make sense? When you worship animals, you treat people like animals. They're always linked, and Solomon, even the wisest person on earth, fell for it, and the consequences were horrendous. Here's what happened. The monarchy split into two nations. The northern tribes were called Israel. There's 10 of them, kind of. Well, here's what they did. They immediately rejected David's line and any authority, obviously, from the sons of David. They established their own dynasties, usually by assassination. They created their own temples. There were 2 temples in the north, one up at the very top in Dan, and then one down at the very south in Bethel. And they created their own golden calves and put them in their temples. They created their own priesthood, their own ephod. And even they changed the festivals. And yet they claimed the same God. It's called henotheism, where they would say that Yahweh is number one, but then there's a pantheon of other gods. Well, actually, it turns out they became an entirely different nation, serving different gods. Now, the guys in the south are called Judah. It's actually 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin together, ironically. They're now best pals. And it turns out the sons of David, the kings of Judah, some of them were pretty good, but there was also some horribly idolatrous ones. And over the years of this 200 years of divided monarchy, there were wars between these 2 nations, occasional alliances between the 2, until finally the injustice that was caused by the idolatry of the north was judged by God with an invasion by the horrible Assyrian armies. And you can read about exactly why God was just in sending this exile in the book of Hosea. It'll break your heart because God's heart was broken. This all happened in 722 BC. All 10 northern tribes were crushed by Assyria. The capital of Samaria burned to the ground. All the tribes were taken into the exile, and this government never returned, ever. The government of the northern tribes never returned. So it's a horrible story. It's a pretty simple spiritual timeline at this point. Over these 200 years, Israel was in a steady decline. They never had a revival in the north. The south had a brief revival with Hezekiah. There was a couple of other good kings there too, Jehoshaphat, among others. But here's what I want to point out. During this period of time, we really begin to see the roles of the prophets lived out. The prophets are more than God's mouthpiece, which is how Deuteronomy 18 describes them. My wife Amherst says the prophets are the clearest expression of God's heart. God had real emotions of love, hope, and anger about the idolatry and injustice that was going on in his people. And God expressed that through the prophets. And you can really learn his worldview, his heart, his feelings about love and sin if you learn the metaphors of the Hebrew prophets, if you learn the artistic forms which these Israelite prophets use, if you can understand how and why they talk the way they did, then you can really get a good grasp of how deep God's heart is. And then you can understand Jesus' heart. Jesus is a real guy who felt all these feelings. And listen, the God of the Old Testament is no different. You learn that from the prophets. So as you read this, let the prophets mentor you. Let the prophets express God's heart, not just the facts. You'll learn about who God is, and you realize that there are facts about God's love for us and his disappointment, his feelings of betrayal, his just anger. You'll learn about humanity. You'll begin to identify with these people groups if you read these prophets and study the background in context. You'll be so angry, or you'll be so excited, and you'll fall in love with these prophets, or your hearts will be broken for them. In the prophets, you'll find the meaning and purpose of life is clarified. The law is more fact specific, but the prophets have to live it out. And you can learn about suffering and death and the details of morality in these prophets. You have to take the time as you study these books and as you let God answer these questions through the writings of the pre-exilic prophets. They're awesome books, my friends. Don't forget, Elijah and Elisha are really important. The whole history of the book of Kings, there's a massive chunk that is really like a microscope on these two prophets, Elijah and Elisha. These are central to the history of the kings of Israel, is their relationship to these prophets. All right, and here's the wrap-up, my friends. This time frame may be completely new information for you. You may not have known that Israel was divided, and that's okay. Jesus and the Holy Spirit knew all about it. And you know what? If you know him, he's going to teach you. The Holy Spirit will help walk you through these books. The Holy Spirit wants you to understand Jesus. It's actually his job. Studying the Bible is not a bad thing. It's not relying on your own strength or your own understanding. Studying the Bible is actually relying on God's understanding. Let God mentor you through these prophets during this horrible, heartbreaking time of the divided kingdom. So get to it, and God bless you.